მოგესალმებით ყველას. უკაცრავად დაგვიანებისთვის ტექნიკური მიზეზი იყო, რომლის საფუძვლებს უნდა ვეძიოთ ძალიან ცუდ მოძრაობაში თბილისში და შესაბამისად არ შეიძლება სტუდენტების ფუნქციაზე გადაეყარა თავისი მანქანა. დღეს ჩვენ გვაქვს მართლა ძალიან სასიხარულო დღე, იმიტომ რომ დღეს ჩვენ გვიწვია ერთ-ერთი ყველაზე მნიშვნელოვანი ჰუმანიტარული ორგანიზმი მსოფლიოში არსებობს, როგორც ევროპაში, ისე ამერიკაში და ამას მე შემთხვევით არ ვამბობ, იმიტომ რომ მას ერთი მხრივ აქვს ევროპული ბექგრაუნდი, მაგრამ ძალიან დიდი ხანია უკვე ამერიკის შეერთებულ შტატებში მოღვაწეობს ჰანს ულრიხ გუმბრეხტი და ჩვენ დღეს გვექნება შეეცადა მოვისმინოთ მისი ლექცია განმანათლებლობის შესახებ და იმ ძალიან მნიშვნელოვანი ფიგურების შესახებ, რომლებიც ამ განმანათლებლობის გულისხმულსა თუ სხვას წარმოადგენენ, როგორც ძალიან დიდრო, მოცარტი და გოია. რამდენიმე სიტყვა თავად პროფესორ გუმბრეხტზე. ის არის სრულიად გასაოცარი სამეცნიერო მომცველობის ადამიანი, რომელიც ერთნაირი სიმარტივითა და ვირტუოზულობით წერს სტატიებს და წიგნებს ესპანური, პორტუგალიური, გერმანული, ფრანგული ლიტერატურების ისტორიაზე, ფილოსოფიაზე, კულტურის ისტორიაზე, სპორტის ისტორიაზე და ასე შემდეგ. თუმცა მინდა აქვე დავამოსო ხუთშაბათს საღამოს ლიგამოში ჩვენ ვექნებოდა მისი წიგნის ფილოლოგიის ძალის პრეზენტაცია და ასევე გადავაცემთ მას, ვივანიჭებთ მას ხუთშაბათსვე ჩვენი უნივერსიტეტის საფაკულტეტო დოქტორობას. ეს წიგნის ჩვენ თარგმნით და ჩვენის გამოცემობაში იქნება გამოქვეყნებული, დაბეჭდვის პროცესშია, შეიძლება ასე ითქვას. პროფესორი გუმბრეხტი არის სტენფორდის უნივერსიტეტის შედარებითი მეცნიერების პროფესორი, არის არა მხოლოდ ძალიან ბევრი კლასიკური მონოგრაფიის ავტორი, მაგალითად მონოგრაფიების რომელზეც დავასახელებ ბიოლოგიის ზავა, ასევე ათლეტური მშვენიერების ქება, ეს არის 1926 წელი, სადაც მართლა შეიმუშავა შესანიშნავი მეთოდოლოგია, რომ რა ეწევა ერთ წელს ქრონოლოგიურად მომხდარი ამბები ერთ ჩარჩოში და ასე შემდეგ. მაგრამ გარდა ამისა, ის არის მართლა ცენტრში იყო მუდმივად მთელი ჰუმანიტარული, ფილოსოფიური, სოციალური და ასე შემდეგ მოძრაობების და ისეთი ადამიანები, რომლებსაც წიგნებს ჩვენ ვკითხავთ და რომელთა შესახებაც ჩვენ ვკითხავთ წიგნებს, მისთვის თითოეული მათგანი არის უაღრეს დაახლოებული და ის ადამიანები, რომელსაც პირველად ინტერაქციის გამოცდილება ჰქონია და ეს ნამდვილად იგრძნობა მის ნაწერებშიც და მის საუბარშიც. ამიტომაც ძალიან მიხარია, რომ ჩვენი ეს კრიზის და კრიტიკის სერია, რომელსაც შვეიცარიის აკადემიური ქსელი უჭერდა მხარს, გრძელდება. ეს არის მორიგი ლექცია, ბევრ ლექციაზე ვიცი, რომ ზოგიერთ თქვენ გასვენა, რომელიც წინა ლექციებს არის ნამყოფი და ძალიან სასიხარულო, რომ დღეს პროფესორი გუმბრეხტმა მისი შესანიშნავი ოჯახი, მისი მეუღლე რიტა, მისი ქალიშვილი ლორა დღეს სტუმრობენ და რა ვიცი, იმედია, რომ ლექციის შემდეგ საინტერესო დისკუსიას გაემართება. ახლა კი დიდი სიამოვნებით გადავცემ სიტყვას პროფესორ გუმბრეხტს.
Thank you so much. I mean, this is thanks first of all for waiting. I mean, you imagine that we had the best intentions to be here at the right time, but the traffic in Tbilisi was too complicated. But thanks for waiting. And before we really get started, I wanted to thank Giga and Tico and the university for the invitation. This is the first time that we are here. And after less than one day, because we arrived yesterday, I think at 9 p.m., my wife and my daughter and I are overwhelmed by the beauty of this city, by the hospitality, and we have decided we will definitely return. Yeah? So that's the most important thing I have to say, and maybe we just start this, no, not seriously. So From my correspondence with the rector of the university, with Gigam, I realized what is the assignment for tonight. The assignment, my task for tonight, was to associate, to connect a current research project that I'm doing with the concept of critique and crisis, and what one can do with the concept of crisis today. Now, the research project I'm currently doing, I'm writing a book about Diderot, about Francisco de Goya, about Lichtenberg, that is a German 18th century philosopher, about Mozart. And why am I writing a book about these protagonists? I'm writing a book about these people because I think they embody a certain mind frame, a certain intellectual possibility of the 18th century that I think cannot be subsumed under the concept of enlightenment. And when we normally say 18th century, in Western culture we think enlightenment, and when we think enlightenment we think the precondition, what we consider democracy, and so forth today. Enlightenment is the normative period for modernity, so to speak. And I was interested in a couple of enlightenment figures like Diderot, like Goya, and that is the two I'm going to refer to today, who cannot be subsumed under enlightenment, although they come out of the 18th century. Is that clear as a mind frame? Now, if I'm saying they are from the 18th century, but they are not enlightenment, what is the concept of enlightenment that I'm presupposing? The concept of enlightenment that I'm presupposing as a background is the concept that I want to call historical culture. Historical culture, and that would be a certain cultural configuration, a certain mental configuration that began to articulate itself between 1718 and 1830 and became mainstream European thought during the 19th century and during much of the 20th century. I associate this mind frame mainly, but absolutely not exclusively, with Hegel. I think the philosopher Hegel is the one who developed, to articulate what we call the historical mind frame, historicity, historical culture, more than anybody else, which didn't mean that people in the 19th century having that mentality needed to read Hegel. But I'm going to talk about Hegel, I'm going to presuppose Hegel because I think he's typical for this mind frame. Now it is interesting that Hegel was both fascinated and irritated by Diderot. Yeah, if you look in the index of the complete works of Hegel, after those people he absolutely had to quote because he came out of them. After references to David Hume and after references to Immanuel Kant, actually the third most frequently quoted author in Hegel is Diderot. And whenever he quotes Diderot, he is irritated by Diderot because he has no way of bringing Diderot into his system. And that's what I found interesting. Whenever he talks about Diderot, he uses the concept of prose of the world, prose of the world. And those among you who are a little bit familiar with Hegel's work know that Hegel always speaks about prose of the world when he's referring to phenomena that do not fit into his mind frame. Yeah? So this is why I'm interested in Diderot, I'm interested in Goya, because they come out of the 18th century, but they represent a mind frame that does not fit into our way of seeing the 18th century. When we say enlightenment, we take a perspective on the 18th century that uses the perspective of historical culture. So enlightenment precisely is what precedes our modern world, and you cannot subsume Diderot, you cannot subsume Goya, you cannot subsume other under this possibility. I think, however, and that will be my main thesis, that people like Diderot, Goya, Lichtenberg, Mozart have a specific affinity of our 21st century mentality. So among the three great intellectuals of French 18th century, Voltaire, Rousseau, Diderot, you can say that the 19th century was Voltaire's century. Everybody was absolutely infatuated with Voltaire. The 20th century, I hope you agree with me, is very much Rousseau's century, the century of égalité, when Rousseau is in the center. And I have a feeling that is part of my hypothesis that the 21st century in that sense could become a Diderot century. I mean, this is not so much about Diderot, this is about a certain mentality. Last initial remarks so that you have an idea of what I'm speaking about. I think the concept of crisis and critique that Giga gave me to play with, the concept of crisis and critique, is a concept that emerges out of the historical mind frame, out of the historical worldview. To believe that analyzing a crisis in the present will allow you to anticipate the future is a typical idea of the historical worldview. Now, if I believe that the historical worldview in the 21st century is perhaps no longer ours, and this is what I believe when I think maybe this could become a Diderot chapter, a Diderot century, then we would say perhaps also this concept of crisis is in crisis. That concept of crisis on whose basis we would anticipate the future can no longer be ours. Yeah? And that will be an implication. I mean, I will critically ask whether we can still use this concept of crisis today. Okay. Now you look all at me like this is a very, very strange lecture. I mean, I was starting like this to give you an impression of what I want to talk about. Can you all hear me? Can you all understand me? I mean, I have no clue whether this has been terribly boring or terribly interesting, but maybe at some point I get into the hermeneutics of the phases. I will give you an outline. This lecture will have 5 parts. In the first part, I will talk about the emergence of the historical worldview between 1780 and 1830. So this is the background. This is mainstream enlightenment, and I will finish this first part trying to explain how I relate the historical worldview to the concept of crisis. In the second part, I will briefly describe this other worldview that I associate with Diderot, with Goya. I think all of you have seen artworks by Goya, yeah? But I don't know, I mean, how many of you have ever read Diderot? Anybody who has ever read anything by Diderot? Nobody, no. Maybe everybody, I mean, it's a stupid question to ask. But the second part, I will give you an impression of why I find Diderot interesting. And in the third part, I will actually try to speak about the crisis of the historical worldview. From when do I believe that the historical worldview enters in a crisis? And I think it enters into a crisis in the mid-20th century. This may be a new hypothesis, but I think this is from when on there was a crisis of the historical worldview. At this point, if you are electronically equipped like everybody in Georgia is, in the Republic of Georgia is, you can see 5 Goya artworks I will refer to. Oh, we have them here. Yeah, we start with this one. We leave this one, okay. Just leave it there. Who has ever seen this etching before? Or who has never seen it? My daughter has never seen it. She can afford that. Okay, we'll talk about that. Okay. First part, emergence of historical worldview. Second, the other worldview coming out of the 18th century. That's Diderot's. Third part, crisis of the historical worldview in the mid-20th century. Fourth part, I'll try to say that today we are living in a social construction of temporality, in a chronotrope, as I call it, that is different from the historical worldview. I believe that except at universities, we are no longer living in the historical worldview today. And finally, I will end up arguing, that will be my fifth part, if the historical worldview is no longer our main social construction of temporality, and if this using crisis in order to predict the future was what the humanities mainly did, the humanities and arts, the Geisteswissenschaften, what could be the task of the Geisteswissenschaften, and how could the Geisteswissenschaften, how could the humanities and arts proceed today? And I will propose you a concept that I will only allude to, and this concept is riskful thinking. I'd say maybe riskful thinking today could replace the historical worldview. Okay, I still don't have an impression of how interesting or boring you find that. Normally, you know, if I knew you, if I know what you knew, This will take another 45-50 minutes to develop. I cannot tell. If you continue looking like you're bored, then I will skip things if we go very, very fast. If slowly I get the impression that some people are passionately following me, then I will talk more and the talk will last for 2 hours. Whatever happens, whether it's very long or very short, the responsibility is completely yours. The responsibility is the responsibility of your faces. Okay, now if I was a flight attendant, I would say fasten your seatbelts. We start now with the emergence of the historical worldview. In the 18th century, and as this is something I know well, or maybe stand up, you can see more of me. So, how did this worldview that Hegel stands for example, and that I think was mainstream for 19th and 20th century Western culture, by Western culture, and for once including your culture, non-Asian culture, for example, how did that emerge? I think the first signs of that we can identify are in the third quarter of the 18th century. And the beginning of that is that a certain group of people, the group of people who called themselves in the koiné, in the general language of the 18th century, les philosophes. But les philosophes in the 18th century did not mean people like Giga. It meant intellectuals. It was the word that we call today intellectuals. They started to become second-order observers. Giga knows this concept. This is a Niklas Luhmann concept. What is a second-order observer? A first-order observer is a Cartesian observer. A first-order observer is a mind standing outside the material world and observing the material world. A second-order observer is an observer who cannot help observing herself or himself in the act of world observation. It becomes habitual to observe yourself in the act of self-observation. So it becomes habitual for a small group, for intellectuals, since the 18th century, to observe themselves in the act of self-observation. And I think it has become habitual for intellectuals until the present day. If you all consider yourself intellectuals, this is why people outside academia think that intellectuals are so strange, because they cannot help observing themselves in the act of self-observation. Now, if that starts in the third quarter of the 17th century, and I will not even try to explain why, you can just observe that the people start observing themselves in the act of self-observation. This has two consequences that people talk about in the late 18th century. Somebody who observes herself in the act of self-observation will realize that the result of her observation depends on the point of view. And as there is always an infinity of points of view, you will have for each object of observation a potential infinity of representations. This is what we can call perspectivism. So the first consequence of second-order observation is this obsession with perspectivism. And while we may think perspectivism is a positive thing, people in the late 18th century did not like that. There is a famous German classical author, Jamil Von Kleist, actually my favorite author, who was not an intellectual. He was a military person. And Kleist only read 10 pages of Kant. And after reading 10 pages of Kant, he entered into what we would call today a clinical depression. Because, well, maybe that happened to you too, but I mean, he said, if I take Kant seriously, there is no reality. Because there's an infinity of representations for each object of reference. So this became a problem in the late 18th century. Now I realize you follow a little more. You can't relate to depression and philosophy. The other problem is, a second-order observer against the Cartesian type of observation, Descartes' type of observation, discovers that there are two modalities of world appropriation. There is world appropriation through concepts, what we call experience. But, and this is what the 18th century and people like Დიდρο discovered, there's also world appropriation through the senses. I mean, I can, for example, look at this board and say, okay, this is a table, this is wood. That is one way of experience, but if I rub my finger against it, it is perception. And the question all of a sudden emerges, how does experience relate to perception. I think these are the two main philosophical problems emerging out of second-order observation in the late 18th century. And I could give you ample documentation that intellectuals didn't like that. This was a problem. Now, astonishingly, while this was perceived as a problem, both problems found quick solutions that people were not aware were solutions. The solution of the second problem, how does experience relate to perception, was very easy. The 19th century simply does not talk about this problem. The problem is excluded. What you call 18th century materialism doesn't appear in the 19th century. I think it comes back in the early 20th century with Einstein, but was not a problem in the 19th century. The second problem, however, the problem of perspectivism, finds a solution that is very remarkable, and that is the basis, the matrix for historical culture. And this solution that nobody thought about as a solution consists in shifting from a mirror-like principle of world representation. So for each object in the world, you have one ideal description. This is the principle of the encyclopedia as a central genre of the 18th century. You switch to a narrative principle of world representation. From the early 19th century, you know, when somebody gets asked, what is Georgia? He will tell the history of Georgia. This was not the case in the 18th century. When people would have been asked, what is Georgia? They would give a geographical description, for example. Since the early 19th century, when you are asked, what is Georgia? You give a historical description. When you're being asked what is a certain animal, what is, for example, a horse, you start telling an evolutionary narrative, and if somebody asks himself what is the spirit, and happens to be the young Hegel, then he writes a book called Phenomenology of the Spirit, which those who know the book know is a narrative. Now, I was very happy that some people agree with me that the phenomenology of the spirit is a narrative. I saw some people nodding, that's good. So, good philosophical culture here at the university. No, I mean, some people will deny that it is a narrative, but it is clearly an evolutionary narrative. Now, why is this a solution? This is a key thesis. It is a solution for the problem of perspectivism, because any narrative discourse allows you to integrate different points of view. My point, if you write a narrative about the phenomenology of the spirit, the narrative allows you to integrate different perspectives on the spirit. And if you write a narrative about the city of Tbilisi, for example, about Georgia, it allows you to integrate different periods, talk about the Middle Ages and talk about Orthodox religion, for example, etc., etc. You get the point. So I would say, to a certain degree, this switch from a mirror-like world representation to a narrative world representation in the early 19th century absorbs the problem of perspectivism. Is that clear to everybody? That is always frustrating for me if people after 10 minutes say that's clear to them, because it took me about 15 years to figure that out. But I want to be generous, so here you have it in 15 minutes instead of 15 years. Okay. Now this is the basis. This is the basis of what people have been calling the historical worldview. And around 1830, the historical worldview is completely centrally institutionalized in Western culture. Let me briefly describe the historical worldview in 5 features. It is a worldview in which people always believe that they leave the past behind themselves. Yeah? This mentality of leaving the past behind yourself belongs to the historical worldview. And it also means the further you believe something behind yourself, the less orientational value it has. Yeah? I mean, does the 5th century BC have any orientational value for us? Not much, and certainly much less than the 20th century. But that is part of the historicist mentality. Historical worldview means, secondly, that the future is an open horizon of possibilities from which we can choose. Whether this is really true is a different question, but that's what people start believing in the 19th century. This is a condition for the mentality of progress, for example. Historical worldview means, thirdly, that the present, and I'm quoting Baudelaire, between that past that we leave behind and that future that we want to shape, that the present is an imperceptibly short moment of transition. To think that the present has no substance, that the present is just the short moment between the past and the future, is something new in the 19th century. This was actually Baudelaire in 1858 who defined that for the first time. It means, in the fourth place, that this short present is the all-important moment of agency. Yeah? Because in this short present, based on experience from the past, we believe that we choose between the possibilities of the future. In the present, based on the past, we shape the future. This is really the historical worldview. And finally, and in the fifth place, we believe that time is a necessary agent of change. That there are no phenomena that can resist transformation in time. It may go very, very fast, like the generations of viruses. Does anybody know how long a generation of viruses lasts? No clue? I mean, it's about half a day. I found it very disappointing. I was always hoping it would be a couple of seconds. But unfortunately, they exist for 6 to 7 hours. So I know that from a colleague at Stanford, actually, who's from the family of Kierkegaard. So her name is Karl Kierkegaard. Okay, this goes very fast. And for example, crystalline configurations take thousands of years to change, but all phenomena change. Now, around 1830, that is completely institutionalized. Right? I mean, it is a condition for evolutionism, it is a condition for Darwin, but it is also a condition for any Hegelian type of worldview. It is a condition for capitalism, because capitalism cannot exist without an open future. But it is also a condition for socialism, because socialism cannot exist with claiming that there is an open future. I want to say that this historical worldview, this social construction of time that is specific, becomes absolutely dominant and mainstream and institutional for what we consider the 19th and early 20th century. Is that clear? Okay, if it's not clear, it's too late, because I will finally come to my second part. And don't fear, I mean, the first part is the longest. So if you extrapolate from now how long the entire talk would last 10 hours or something like that, but I will not speak for 10 hours. Okay, second part. Now remember, I promised you to give you a brief impression what I associate Diderot, Goya, and I will only talk about these two with, as opposed to the worldview of Hegel, as opposed to the historical worldview. And these are all reasons that irritated Hegel. In the first place, remember, I was trying to explain how the historical worldview is a solution to the problem of perspectivism. Yeah? Diderot, for example, does not try to solve the problem of perspectivism. Contingency, and I prefer to use the German word, contingence, is central for Diderot's worldview. I don't know whether any of you have ever read what is considered to be Diderot's most important novel, Jacques le Fataliste. Has anybody read Jacques le Fataliste? You have read everything. Fantastic. Jacques le Fataliste is a conversation between a servant and the aristocrat. And normally in the 18th century we would expect the aristocrat to be very, very stupid, like in Beaumarchais, and the servant being very intelligent. No, in Diderot, the servant is actually the complete idiot. For whatever happens, the servant is saying, c'était la faute de la fatalité. It had to happen this way. And this is very much like Hegel, for example. There is historical necessity. Whether the aristocrat says things happen randomly. Things happen randomly, so that means the center of the world for Diderot always allows for different interpretations. And I want to exemplify this with Goya. You see, this is among 80 etchings called Capriccios from the early 1790s. This is number 43. And number 43 is probably the central one. Goya had originally placed it number 1. And he was seemingly scared that he might get into trouble, so he placed it into number 43, which is the most random number. But this is important, this is Capriccio number 43. Now you all you know what it means. You have all heard what that means. You are normally told and taught that it means when reason sleeps, the monster's awake. Yeah? Who has not heard that? When reason sleeps, the monster's awake. But the point is, it can mean also something completely different in Spanish. It can also mean the exact opposite. It can also mean if you dream of reason, then the monster's awake. Get my point? It can grammatically, it can mean the two things, and the two things mean the opposite. So one thing is pro-enlightenment. When reason sleeps, the monster's awake. That's pro-enlightenment. And the other one is 180 degrees anti-enlightenment. When you dream of reason, the monster's awake. Do you see this point? So this is Goya, who I think, like Diderot, likes contingents. Yeah? He likes situations where you do not know, where there is no necessary interpretation. Grammatically, both interpretations are equally possible. They're both completely correct in the Spanish grammar. Only, of course, in the mainstream European education, you were only told the first meaning. Yeah, because the first meaning is the Enlightenment meaning. This means, secondly, so first thing, in Diderot's or Goya's worldview, polyperspectivism survives. Right? Secondly, if polyperspectivism survives, you need judgment. You need judgment in the sense of the third critique of Kant. Judgment in the sense that you have to make a decision, and for that decision you have neither an inductive nor a deductive pattern. You have to use your reason to make a decision. You have to use your reason. Do you want the first or the second meaning of this sentence, for example? Is that clear? And nobody helps you. You have to make a decision. So judgment, very different from Hegel. I mean, Hegel, there's always a necessarily correct solution. So here you have to make judgment. Is that clear? Thirdly, the other problem that the historical worldview eliminated, the problem between world appropriation through concepts, experience, and world appropriation through the senses, is not eliminated in Diderot's worldview. I will give you an example from another text by Diderot that very few people read, and it's a very interesting text, Le Rêve d'Alembert, The Dream of d'Alembert. This is a fictional text about somebody who used to be Diderot's friend, the mathematician d'Alembert, but when he wrote this text they were no longer friends. And it is the following story. So, I would never tell this story in the United States because it's a very puritanical country, but I understand that the Republic of Georgia is much less puritanical. I give you this story in the Georgia version. So, d'Alembert, the mathematician, the fictional d'Alembert, is obsessed with a problem that's a very typical 18th century problem, namely how do sperms and eggs make a fusion? The 18th century never managed to explain that, but people were obsessed with that. And d'Alembert tries to find a mathematical solution, but he doesn't find a mathematical solution, and then all of a sudden he catches a flu and enters in a fever. And then Diderot describes his fever dreams. And in those fever dreams, mathematics goes slowly into something erotic, into erotic imaginations. And his woman friend, Madame de Lespinasse, is standing next to his bed, and she sees that there are strange movements going on under the bed cover. And she sees that all of a sudden he is in an ecstatic moment and sighs. This, of course, was an ejaculation. And this is Diderot's irony, that why do we have to think so much mathematically and rationally about something that can be so glorious when it just happens? And Madame de Lespinasse is actually complaining with the doctor. He says, when he sleeps with me, when we have sex together, he is never as relaxed and as joyful as in this moment of fever, right? So you get the point that Diderot wants to make here. There is not only one way of world appropriation, by mathematics, by concepts. There's always also a central point of world observation. Look at this Goya etching, for example. It is strange that the monsters
that you see here are actually not evil monsters. See, they are owls. They're coming close to this philosopher, the philosopher Jovellanos, whom he means. And maybe you want to be touched by them. Maybe, you know, I mean, I'm playing with this ambiguity in Diderot. Maybe you want to be touched by them. Maybe those monsters, the monsters of the world, are not so negative. Okay, you get my point. First, contingence remains. In the second place, you need judgment. In the third place, the essential side of the world does not get eliminated. So, the third difference is, in the historical worldview, human self-reference is very Cartesian. You are only a mind. You are only a mind in the sense of Descartes, I think, therefore I am. So the ontology of human existence depends on thinking, depends on your mind. In Diderot's worldview, your self-reference as a human being is always both spiritual and physical. The other most important text by Diderot, called Le Neveu de Rameau, Rameau's nephew, is a dialogue between two characters. One is an ironic self-representation, le philosophe, the philosopher, and the philosopher can only think all the time. The other person, Rameau's nephew, is what we would call in American English today a homeless person. Somebody who sleeps in the street in Palais Royal, somebody who talks obscenely all the time, somebody who's a very aggressive beggar. But if you read Diderot's text, you will realize that the sympathy is clearly on the side of this person who lives a physical life, yeah? Not on the side of his self-reference, not on the side of the philosopher. And you find something very similar in Goya. Now you have to help me. And in another Goya sequence, Desastres de la Guerra, there are 48 etchings. You believe this one? Okay.
Oh, should I?
Yeah. Eight books.
This one?
And 4. No. This one. Okay, etchings number 40 to 50 go like this. This is about the independence war of Spain against Napoleon. And it ends like this. Number 48, as you have seen, is an allegory of truth. You see a classical allegory of truth with her eyes closed. And then Goya asks, did truth die? Yeah, and then number 49, you see the same allegory of truth, and she's slightly opening her eyes. And he says, did she resurrect, question mark. And if you are in the historical worldview, you would expect that yes, truth resurrected. But actually, this is how Goya finishes. He finishes with this young peasant woman, that's the iconographic reading of this young peasant woman, with her naked breasts, and she is meant to be pregnant. And Goya says, but this is life. You get my point? He ends up saying, this is life. So he plays with the idea that you expect truth to be the important thing. He says, did truth resurrect? We do not know. And he ends with the statement, this is life. Yeah, so a human self-reference, not in the sense of reason, not in the sense of truth, but in the sense of life is central. You get my point. Now, this has been an attempt to give you an idea of what this other worldview is that comes out of the 18th century. Yeah, this is not only Diderot, this is not only Goya, this is also people like Lichtenberg. I think Mozart, for example, the Mozart of the magic flute is very much this worldview. And I'm not saying it is the better worldview. I'm also not saying this worldview was ever repressed. It remains peripheral in the 19th century. It has been floating through the 19th century. People like Schopenhauer, for example, have been interested in that. You can clearly say there's an affinity with Nietzsche, but it has never been central. It has never been around, it has never been central. It has also never aggressively challenged the historical world. But you realize my point, and in a way the intention of my book. The intention of my book is to remind us today of this possibility of thinking, which, and this will be part of what I try to develop in the next 20 minutes, has an affinity with our present-day thinking. Is that clear? Okay, you see the second part was slightly shorter than the first part. I come to the third part, which is the shortest of them all. Crisis of the historical worldview. I mean, one of the authors who fully embraced the historical worldview, and the older among you, those who have my age, in this country should be very familiar with that, was of course Karl Marx. I mean, the young Karl Marx, who goes to Berlin in 1836 and becomes a Hegelian of the left, is as Hegelian as it possibly gets. And in 1848, in the revolutionary year, together with Engels, who is already his friend, he feels that he can make predictions of what will happen in this revolutionary year. And something that Marxism has ever denied happened, something very embarrassing. Marx, in March 1848, prognosticates, based on Hegel, that the class-free society will be fulfilled by the end of the year 1848. Which you all know, we are still waiting for the class-free society. We're still waiting for ideal. But Marx realized that to easily prognosticate the future based on historical analysis, based on a crisis year, yeah, you get my point. This was a crisis year, 1848. So he thought if you have a crisis, you can look into this crisis, and based on the analysis of the crisis, you can tease out regularities of historical development, and you can prognosticate the future. This is how he used the concept of crisis, only the prognostications were completely absurd. Yeah? I mean, if you say that 1848 was the first revolution with a proletarian participation, European proletariat was in much worse shape at the end of 1848 than at the beginning, although Marx had predicted that this would already be the fulfillment of the class-free society. But Marx draws consequences, and this is interesting. Marx, who in the original version of the mythology of the class struggle only has three social classes, namely aristocracy, bourgeoisie, and proletariat, adds more social classes. Only from 1848 on, he adds the petite bourgeoisie, he adds the lumpenproletariat, he adds the peasants, and so forth, so he makes the situation more complex. He also adds the famous distinction between basic structure and infrastructure, so that he can explain through culture why certain developments do not happen immediately. You get my point? I mean, Marx reacts to the failure of his own crisis analysis by making the whole set of prognostication more complex. Yeah? This is Marx's reaction. I mean, that type of crisis happens to the historical worldview all the time. I mean, people realize that their prognostications never come true, so they make the machine of prognosticating the future more complex. As Niklas Luhmann was once saying, so complex that nobody can afford it anymore. It just becomes too expensive to prognosticate the future. I mean, Luhmann, we both like, I don't know how many people know his work, was once saying, we are still able to prognosticate the future, but it is so expensive that the better advice is to buy insurance against the future that you do not want. Yeah? So it becomes so expensive that you cannot afford it. But in the mid 20th century, you realize that there is a different crisis of the historical worldview, a more serious crisis of the historical worldview. And among many possible examples, I will give you 3 or 4. I start with Walter Benjamin, and one of the most frequently quoted essays in the humanities, in the Geisteswissenschaften. And these are Benjamin's theses on the history of philosophy of history. They were written in 1940, and people hardly ever realize that they were written after the Molotov-Ribbentrop or the Hitler-Stalin Pact. Now imagine Benjamin's mentality. This is a German Jew who had escaped from Hitler to France, and who knew that France would soon be conquered by Germany, and who had all his hope invested in the Soviet Union. And now the Soviet Union has a contract with Nazi Germany. That means there is no open future for him anymore. Yeah? And that means that he changes the philosophy of history. And this explains why in this very beautiful text, the angel of the future goes with his back towards the future, looks to the past, and still receives some energy to go to the future. But the future is no longer an open future. Realize that. That is Benjamin's situation. Another text, 1947, Heidegger's letter on humanism. There is one paragraph where Heidegger says, how do I react to this experience of World War II? I react by saying, how could we ever be so stupid to believe that we humans are equipped with a mind that is capable of assuring our own survival? I think in the year 2016 that's an important thought. Why do we think, that's a theological thought, that we are smart enough to guarantee our own survival as a species? And I give you one third and final example, and this would be an entire interesting book to write about the crisis of the historical worldview in the mid-20th century. And that is a book that most of you may have heard mentioned, a book that had a strong impact when it first appeared. It is a book by Jean-Francois, the French philosopher. The book was published in 1973, The Postmodern Condition. And if you read the argument, you realize that what Lyotard does, he criticizes that solution of the early 19th century that uses historicism to give a solution to polyperspectivism. Yeah, Lyotard in this book emphasizes that there are many, many local histories, and the argument is really, no, history is not a solution to polyperspectivism, because whenever you have a historical fact, you can write as many histories about it as you want. You get my point? So in that sense, if you want to use this concept, Lyotard's postmodern condition is an undercutting, is a deconstruction of the historical worldview that had a very, very strong impact on Western thought. I do not think this is the best book that Lyotard ever wrote, but it is a decisive book in a decisive moment. Okay, so you realize my thesis is that the historical worldview that had been so centrally institutionalized since the early 19th century until the middle of the 20th century, that had been shared by Marxism and Nazism, for example, strange as that sounds, all of a sudden enters in a crisis. And my thesis is, and now I start the fourth part of the lecture, so you don't have to leave anymore, it's no longer worth leaving, and it'll be soon be done. In the fourth part, I believe that actually these are signs of a different construction of temporality, of a different chronotrope emerging, and that will be my fourth thesis, my fourth part. You get my point? So I think today I will talk about that in more detail. In a history department or in politics, we are still in the historical worldview, but in our everyday, when we wake up and brush teeth, for example, just test tomorrow morning when you brush teeth, we are in a different worldview, we are in a different chronotrope, we are in a different social construction of reality. And let me briefly and by contrast describe this different construction of temporality. And maybe this is interesting, maybe you live that in a different way in the Republic of Georgia, but I think normally when I'm developing this thesis with my Californian students, or I talk about that in EU Europe, people say, yeah, that's true, that's actually how we see the world. I've also written a book about that, which is called Our Broad Present, but I mean, as I'm here, why would you read my books? So, okay. I think our future, brushing teeth in the morning, is no longer an open horizon of possibilities that we can shape. But I believe our future in 2016 is a future filled with threats that come towards us. Think of global warming, think of the exhaustion of natural resources, think of the demographic development. I mean, how many people can this planet feed? We may slow down it, yeah? I mean, demographic growth has slowed down, but one day there will be too many people living on this planet. One day Russia will no longer have a natural gas. One day we will not have airplanes we don't have because they need gas to fly, they cannot fly on electric energy, and so forth and so forth. I'm not in a situation to judge whether these fears are justified or not. What I'm saying, however, is that our everyday experience of the future is occupied by these fears. Is that clear? In the second place, and that may surprise you, I do not believe that we live in a time where we let the past behind ourselves. I actually think about electronic communication, that our present is absolutely inundated, aggressively inundated by pastness. Yeah? The problem today is to forget anything. In the electronic age, absolutely nothing gets forgotten. I mean, everybody knows that. I mean, in the olden days, if you were writing a dissertation in the humanities, let's say history, you always had an excuse that your own library would not have all the documents you would have liked to read. Today you don't have this excuse anymore. I don't know whether you have ever heard about the Google, I mean Google indeed, like GM, Google stands for project. This is a project to make every document existing on this planet available in every computer screen. And rumor has it that this is not a technological problem, it is only a legal problem. So imagine the day that you can have every document and your laptop, nobody is able to write a dissertation in the humanities anymore. You get my point? I mean, our present is inundated by pastness. You understand this point? And in the third place, I believe that between that future that is blocked and that past that inundates the present, we are no longer living in this historicist present that was short, but I believe we are living in an ever-broadening present of simultaneities. We are living in an ever-broadening present of simultaneities. The older among you may ask themselves, I mean, I find this interesting in whichever country I go. In the US, for example, say, could you have any periodization since September 11, 2001? And people say, no, this is one present. There nothing, I mean, of course, lots of things happen, but we have the impression that nothing happened. Yeah, if you go to Russia, which I do every year, they say, well, there was 1989 collapse of state socialism, then were 10 years of Yeltsin, where nobody had anything to eat, but the hopes were high. And ever since, we have had the emergence of Putin, and that will last forever now. Yeah? Every joke, 1 out of 2 jokes people tell in Russia, is about this being a broad present. You get my point? I have the impression that our everyday present is a broad present of simultaneities. And if we associated that short present with a Cartesian self-reference, remember, this is the present where, based on experience from the past, you choose among the possibilities of the future. That implies that we think about ourselves in a Cartesian way. I think, therefore I am. If this I think, therefore I am is associated with the short present, and if our present today is an ever-broadening present of simultaneities, I think this could explain why our way of thinking about ourselves as humans today tendentially includes more of the body, includes more of our somatic life. When this happens in philosophy, I mean, I don't know what Giga thinks about that. I mean, I don't have any high hopes about neurophilosophy, but it is interesting that something like neurophilosophy exists. But this is also interesting about our everyday practices. I mean, I don't know about Georgia, but in certain countries of the world, certainly in California, more than half of the population starts the day by jogging. Yeah? As you can see, I don't, but I mean, when I was 10 years old, nobody was jogging. I mean, to bring the body back into existence, really, in an existential way, I think is typical for our time. And finally, I think in our mentality today, time is no longer a necessary agent of change. I'm once again not saying I can objectively describe that, but I think certain philosophical topics and themes that used to be absolutely unacceptable when I was 20 years old, like Nietzsche's intuition of the eternal return. I remember I did my first year at the University of Munich, I did a philosophy seminar with Grassi, an Italian existentialist philosopher, on Nietzsche, and said Nietzsche is fantastic except the idiotic idea about the eternal return. That could not be accepted in 1967. Today I sometimes think that is the most fascinating part in Nietzsche's philosophy. You get my point, we have an affinity to that. Now, my point is that this temporality of the broad present does not exclude the historicist temporality, because you realize it doesn't exclude anything. Everything that existed in the past is part of our present. So there are certain pockets, as we would say in American English, in society, for example, departments of history, where you still have to think in a historicist way, and nobody will ever get a doctorate in the department of history if she or he does not think in a historicist way. Yeah? And politics. I mean, you cannot run any electoral campaign without promising that the future will be different. Nobody believes it, but nevertheless, the genre of politics demands that. Nobody really believes that Trump will make America great again. But you have to use this rhetoric in order to run a political campaign. You get my point? So my first point is today we are living in a simultaneity between the historical worldview and this broad present worldview. I also want to say this broad present worldview, which is ours, has a certain affinity with the Diderot point of view. Yeah, this broad present of simultaneities seems to be a present similar to Diderot's present of contingents. Everything has different interpretations. Judgment is important. And like Diderot, I think the somatic dimension of our existence is coming back. I'm not saying that this broad present has emerged under the influence of Diderot. That would be completely idiotic. That would be one of those humanities ideas that nobody believes in. But I think there's an affinity. Now, final part, and I promise you I will be done in 6 minutes and 32 seconds. Final part. If this hope that the analysis of a crisis would allow us to predict the future was related to the historical worldview, and if we can say today the historical worldview still exists, but it is not what convinces anybody. Yeah? I mean, we all feel that in political campaigns. All the politicians will tell you how they will shape the future in a new way, but nobody really believes it. You still vote. But many people don't vote anymore because they realize this will not come true. And if you can also say that the most interesting part of the humanities in the age of the historical worldview was to analyze the present in order to prognosticate the future. I would say this was the center of the humanities. To analyze the present, taking into account the past, to have an idea of what the future might bring. This, I think, was the identity of the humanities. If we say perhaps this doesn't work anymore today, and perhaps the fact that this doesn't work is one of the reasons for the crisis of the humanities. Why, except until we see very few people come to lectures in the humanities, what could be the alternative today? And I will finish by trying to talk about the alternative. The alternative that I propose would be called Riskful Thinking, and I will use the remaining 5 minutes and 28 seconds to explain Riskful Thinking. By Riskful Thinking, I'm using in the first place another thought by Luhmann, whom Giga and I happen to like. Luhmann says all social systems reduce complexity. Yeah? There's always too much outside world complexity, and the economic system, for example, says this republic you can only pay with one currency, and in the US you can only pay with dollars. So there's a certain legislation about economic interactions. You reduce complexity. Luhmann says only the university system in modern societies is a system whose task it is not to reduce complexity, but whose task it is to increase complexity. So this would be my first claim. I think the humanities should not be about giving solutions. The humanities should not be about giving answer to central questions. The humanities should be about making our worldview more complex, even in the sense of more complicated. I mean, I know when I'm saying this, and some people look at me like saying he has lost it, isn't that completely crazy? But think about seminars, for example. Think about lectures that you hear. When do you go home and think it was a good lecture? In my case, I would say this is normally not the case if somebody has given me a solution, but if somebody has given me an impulse to think about things in a way that I never thought before. Whether I agree or not is not so important. You get my point? So, riskful thinking would be, in the first place, the task of the humanities and arts above all, to make your worldview more complex, to be able to think in more alternatives. Now, why do we call that riskful thinking? We call it riskful thinking because this increasing complexity is not something you would like to do in your everyday life. To give you an example, imagine that the rector of this university all of a sudden, while he's listening to me, starts to have a very painful expression on his face, and you realize it is not because he dislikes my lecture, because he has a pain in his stomach. And then we call it, Tico calls the doctor comes, oh my God, this is peritonitis. And they bring him quickly to the university hospital, and while they're giving him the anesthesia, the doctor says to him, you are so honored. Today is the first time that I try a new access to your appendix. This is my experiment today. That would be wishful thinking, but you wouldn't like that, right? I mean, in everyday life, we don't like wishful thinking. In everyday life, and this is why I think the university is the place for wishful thinking. And this is why I think it is good. I mean, normally we say the university is not allowed to be an ivory tower. University has to be engaged with society. I actually think for the humanities, it is a good thing that the university be an ivory tower. That you can think about things in the humanities that you are not allowed to think about elsewhere. And I will give you an example. This is an example for good riskful thinking. I told Giga about this today at lunch. Before I left Germany, it was in the year 1988, I invited Jacques Derrida to my then very tiny university in Germany, and that was for the first time that Derrida came to Germany. And it was like every other year in German philosophy, a year of a Heidegger crisis, you know? Because philosophers in Germany discover every other year that Heidegger was a Nazi, that brings them into a crisis, and then they have somehow to overcome it. So, and Derrida was talking about Heidegger, and as always he was saying the greatest philosopher of the 20th century. And then a student politely interrupted him and said, Professor Derrida, why don't you speak about Heidegger being a Nazi? I mean, how can you say he was the greatest philosopher of the 20th century? And Derrida gave an answer. I'm not a deconstructivist, I was never very fond of Derrida's philosophy, but he gave an answer in this moment that I think is the most beautiful example for riskful thinking. He said, Mon cher jeune ami, I do know that Heidegger was a Nazi. This is not interesting. The only interesting question is, and this was a real question, could he have been the greatest philosopher of the 20th century without having been a Nazi? No, get my point. I passionately hope that the answer is no, that he would have been an even better philosopher without having been a Nazi. But I think there has to be one institutional space where this question is possible. This should not be radio, this should not be television, this should not be daily newspapers. This should be the humanities. This should be a philosophy seminar. So you get an impression of what I understand by riskful thinking. We should be the one place where any counterintuitive question can be asked. And I think for that too, it is a good thing that we are far away from the society, that we are an ivory tower, because that enables us in the humanities to play with imagination, to imagine things that nobody in everyday life imagines. And I would like to end with a vision of Wilhelm von Humboldt, who's one of those German authors whom I love to quote. Some of you may have heard about this beautiful memorandum. It was a draft, it was not published, of a text that he wrote, remarks towards the foundation of a university in Berlin, zu Berlin, from 1810. It was a brainstorming. I mean, he wanted to found a university in Berlin, he founded it. That's today's Humboldt University. And here is how Humboldt describes what the university as a place can be. And I think in a way that is the most beautiful description of what I call riskful thinking. He says, and I'll make a long story short, it's a place where the different tonality of the intellectual enthusiasm of the students and the different tonality of the intellectual enthusiasm of the professors inspire each other, where the intellectual investment of the young inspires the professor and the professor inspires the young, and precisely this coexistence of those different intellectual enthusiasms in their different tonality makes it possible to think at the university what you can never think outside the university. So my hope during this first visit to your country, to your university, is that the humanities at your university will precisely develop in such a place, and I thank you for the attention.
Thank you so much, Seth, for this elegant, brilliant and witty lecture. We didn't expect anything less. But there is an interesting link between the reputation which comes to you through reading books or you're listening to videos on the one hand, and on the other hand, sexual experience of it. And I'm sure to be speaking in the name of the audience as well to say that we're heavily impressed. And now I'm opening the floor for questions. But first one I would like to ask myself.
Good. Let me take something to write.
Okay.
My daughter likes pads. I take my own here. Okay.
The question is actually, when talking about Ditro and contrasting him with the historical worldview, could we extrapolate a little bit and contrast his literature on a formal level with the literature as we know it from the 19th century and as it has come to us as a kind of establishment of 19th century realistic literature? I mean, don't we have this feeling that Ditro is far closer to our literary sensibility than, for example, this established, formalized Balzac and tradition onwards? And where do you find the major difference? Not in philosophy, but on the literary level.
First of all,
one has to congratulate the rector if he asks you a question, right? I mean, the microphone didn't want to convey that. I think this is a fabulous question, as if you were a literary critic. I mean, to say that in a country that, again, for the older generation was a officially communist region of the world, I quote Georg Lukács. Yeah? I think Georg Lukács was right in identifying Balzac, that's how I understand Lukács, as an author who was completely under the impression of the historical worldview. mean, Balzac was politically a monarchist, which means he was outside the historical worldview, but in his mentality he was passionately in the historical worldview. I mean, in the Avant-propos à la Comédie Humaine, he writes, I write the history, the actor, the agent of my novels is French society, and I'm the secretary. I describe how French society transforms itself. Yeah, this means, the same is true in a way for Diderot. If you read, for example, Illusion perdue, which I think is his most important novel, even more important than Madame Bovary, this is the 1848 revolution. While Pécuchet, he describes how stupid intellectuals have become all of a sudden. So, Zola writes in a way, in 20 novels, the history of the Second Empire in France. I mean, the great, same is true for Tolstoy, the same is true for Fontana. I mean, the central part of European literature, Western literature in the 20th century, what we call literary realism, capital R, is engaged, fully engaged in a historical worldview. Now, if you read Diderot's narratives, in the first place, narrative is not necessarily central for Diderot. What is interesting about Diderot's work has no center. Some people say the center of Diderot's work is having been the editor of the Encyclopédie. And that means, of course, you have no center. Yeah? And Diderot, in the Encyclopédie, wrote about everything. He wrote the entry on l'esprit, the spirit, but he also wrote the entry on boucher, the butcher. Yeah? I mean, can you imagine the same person writing on the butcher and on the spirit? That's Diderot. There is no center. Now, if you concentrate on Diderot's narratives, and I think the two most important narratives are Jacques le Fataliste and Le Rêve d'Alembert. Let me give you an example of Jacques le Fataliste. The first sentence in Jacques le Fataliste goes like this. So this is this dialogue between the aristocrat and Jacques. Where did they come from? Next sentence, who cares? I will not tell you. Where would they go? It is not important, and maybe I tell you at the end of this novel. You get my point? This is a dialogue that goes on, a very beautiful dialogue. And that all of a sudden it finishes, and it has no trajectory. It has no teleology. It goes nowhere. The same with what happens to be my favorite text, Le Neveu de Rameau. It is this conversation between this crazy guy, who is among other things also a pimp who prostitutes his wife, very, very strange character, and the philosophe. There is a certain trajectory because it becomes more and more clear, like in Jacques le Fataliste, that the idiot is the philosophe, and the somehow intelligent person is Le Neveu de Rameau. But it ends actually with Le Neveu de Rameau all of a sudden telling the philosophe, oh, I hear the bells ringing, I have an appointment in half an hour, I leave you now. And it's a little bit like Diderot telling you, dear reader, this has been enough, I stop now. You get my point? I mean, Diderot's narratives have no trajectory, which during the dominance of literary realism, people said is not good literature. I would actually say, perhaps precisely this lack of a trajectory is something that makes his novels interesting. If you one example, I don't know whether anybody reads this author in Georgia. In the last trimester at Stanford, I was teaching an undergraduate seminar on the novel. And it turns out that the favorite 20th century novelist of my Californian students was almost unanimously Murakami, the Japanese author. Now Murakami has no trajectory. And I think he's a fantastic narrator, but a little bit like Diderot, at some point the novel finishes and you don't know quite why it finishes. So I feel, I'm not saying Murakami is Diderot, but you get my point. I mean, Murakami is much more similar to the Diderot narrative structure than to the Balzac narrative structure. I know that this was about 10 times more of an answer than you wanted, but I wanted to see whether people here read Murakami too. I'm very happy to see that this is the case.
Thank you very much. So, please.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk. And I wanted to ask you a question about the place for ethics and the possible place for ethics in that perspective, because if we accept that there are not like possible futures as they might have been in the past, and in terms of like also the threats and those angels coming back and those environmental disasters, is there the place for ethics? And if there is, what kind of ethics could that be? More universal, sort of deontological, or utilitarian, if that is a dichotomy?
I will give you an answer that you will find disappointing. In my own teaching, and I would never make a prescription. I mean, I have not been a dean or a university president my entire life, and I would have been a horrible dean. I mean, just not good for that. But I try to never use that concept and to never make it a point. I will give you an example. I was teaching a course for freshmen, first year college students, with a colleague from religious studies in that time that the re-election of George W. Bush happened. Yeah? And my colleague was telling me, this was one day before the election, we should use this lecture to tell the students not to vote Bush. And as you may imagine, I didn't vote Bush either, but I say only over my dead body will we use the class to tell the students what to think. Yeah? I think our task has to be to enable them to think, but not to give solutions. This is what I mean by riskful thinking. Now, I'm not saying that one shouldn't talk about ethics. I'm not saying that there are no ethical problems, but I feel that the best use that we can make of this tradition of the humanities that has come upon us is to use them to complexify the worldview. If you would allow me to use sports language, so to speak, to learn them practice making decisions. They should make decisions. I mean, we should enable them to make good decisions about whom they vote, how they want to spend their life, and so forth and so forth. But I think I feel we have gotten too much in the business of telling our students how to lead their lives, and I think this is the bad version of what we call political correctness. And I think it is politically very incorrect to tell our students how to lead their lives.
Okay, I have, if I may, one reaction and one question separately. When you were talking about the crisis of historical worldview and this understanding of broad present or broad today, I had this idea that maybe we have had this crisis of historical worldview in the past and now return to it. In Georgia, I think we had this period of crisis of historical worldview in Brezhnev's time. There are not so many people who lived in that time here.
I didn't live here, but
so there was no longer prospect of communism. Nobody believed in communism. But there was this eternal presence of Brezhnevite existence. So when nothing happened, there was eternal presence of Brezhnev without any future. But once that ended and communism ended, now we are all the time living historical worldview, because we always expect visa-free regime with Europe, we expect map with NATO, we expect having real democracy, and somehow, because we don't have what is now, it's not a real democracy. And when I talk to students about, I teach democracy and democratization, things like that, they all expect that this is not real democracy, that it will come, a little bit like communism, right? So we return to it. So maybe we are different from California in that sense, because you already don't have a kind of open horizon of possibilities, because you cannot come up with any idea of possibilities expect for global warming or some kind of disaster. Yes, that's about...
I get the point.
Yeah. And now the question about the last part of your presentation about this riskful thinking, right? One wonderful word. By the way, I did not know about this question of Derrida, which was an answer to another question. I think it's fascinating. And you somehow linked it to some resuscitation or rehabilitation of idea of university as ivory tower, right? Some space which is somehow a little bit removed or distanced from everyday world, and that somehow immediately brought to me idea of Glasperlenspiel of Heinrich Hessen. So one question is, would you relate it to that in a way? But another question is, another sub-question is, what is the risk of riskful thinking? What risks are there? If it's just somehow intellectual spiel in university, or there is something, some real risk there?
Thank you very much. And it is also nice to realize I've never talked to you, and then people ask you questions about talking for 65 minutes, and the questions are right on the money, as we say in California. They're right what I'm really concerned about. I thank you and everybody who has been asking. The ethics question is super important, the literature question was super important. I thank you for that. I was telling my daughter and my wife, I've never spoken in this country. I mean, what is it going to be like? And then to speak and to realize that you said, get such good questions, that is fabulous. That doesn't mean that we agree. Right. Okay. See, my argument goes like follows. Of course, I think that the university at large and the humanities in specific, especially at a state university, at a university that's based on taxpayers' money, different from my university. I'm teaching at a private university that's not based on taxpayers' money. It's based on taxpayers' money, and in general, it should have a social function. Now, secondly, I believe that in general, in the past 50 years, the university internationally, in most departments, has become an institution of transmission of knowledge. And there's nothing wrong with that, except that this president or this rector and I happen to be in the humanities. And if you say the university in the humanities should transmit knowledge, that's not a good answer. Yeah? I mean, who would need knowledge in art history? Who would need knowledge in the history of philosophy? Who would need knowledge about Balzac or Flaubert or Diderot? I mean, this can be very interesting, but there's no need. Yeah, I mean, you know, a very small population will perhaps become the humanities professor of the future. So I'm asking myself, that's the key question. In which way can the humanities make a relevant contribution for society? And this is actually the larger perspective of my answer with riskful thinking. If precisely it uses this strange status of being remote from society, yeah? I mean, what you discuss in a philosophy seminar, in a history seminar, in a literature seminar, does not immediately become reality. This is why Derrida can ask the question in the philosophy lecture, would Heidegger have been the greatest philosopher of the 20th century without being Nazi? Once again, I hope that the answer is yes, he would have been much, much better without being a Nazi. But there has to be a place where you can ask this question. There has to be a place where you can produce a complexity that you cannot produce anywhere else in society. And this is why I think, I'm not saying the riskful thinking is the answer to the question, but I want to point in the direction what the humanities should be. Another way of saying the same is that they should cultivate much more than they have done in the past counterintuitively. Yeah? Luhmann, for example, whom we both like, is very strong in producing counterintuitive thinking. Yeah? I mean, if you get definitions like Luhmann, so for example, Vertrauen. What is Vertrauen? It's a mechanism of reducing complexity in society. And then you think about, oh, this is an interesting way. I've never thought about trust like that. Yeah? I mean, get my point. This is what I think we should, there's no recipe. By saying people already produce plausible answers, produce rational answers outside the humanities. Maybe we should be tendentially more counterintuitive. This is one answer. About the broad present, I mean, first of all, I just thank you very much for what you said about the Brezhnev era, because I sometimes believe precisely that the collapse of state socialism was not only a function of the military pressure from the US during Reagan years. It was not only an implosion of the socialist economy, it was also the end of the historical worldview. I mean, when people your generation, I talk to them in Russia, they always tell me, well, until Brezhnev, we somehow believed that we would win the Cold War, and then all of a sudden it was over. I mean, this open future, you know, this open future that you can shape, that socialism will win, all of a sudden disappeared, and with that, the motivation was absorbed. There was no more motivation to contribute to the advent of communism. I find that interesting. Yes, I agree with you, and that is also true for California West Coast and for Silicon Valley. There has been a certain return to try and predict the future. But I think this prediction of the future politically has turned out to be so little powerful in recent years. I mean, nobody has been able to predict what would happen. Yeah? I mean, look at the history of your country. I think this is very difficult to predict. That I would once again say it is probably cheaper to buy an insurance against the future that you do not want than trying to predict the future. There is, however, one level of our everyday life, and that is quite interesting philosophically speaking, where we are completely living on prediction. And these are things, strange as it sounds, like for example the weather report. So today when you travel, as we were traveling, we could see what the weather in this city will be every day of this week, and my wife and my daughter could select their clothes accordingly, which 20 years ago would have been impossible. Why it is possible? It is possible because we now have electronic technology that can process an enormous amount of data, and you can't predict certain things. So much of our practical life today is based on prediction. Only it is my impression that political, cultural, and economic life do not function this way. I mean, you know, the attempts to prognosticate economic changes have been enormous, but it just does not happen. I mean, I hear from history department, from economy departments that until the present day, nobody has managed to explain the 1929 collapse of Wall Street. Why this happened in 1929? Yeah? So there seem to be certain sections of society where prediction is impossible, and this is why I think the strength of the humanities is rather to imagine, and I say imagine almost in the literary sense, to imagine possibilities of alternative futures. For example, and I stop with that, I mean, not the discussion, will go endlessly as far as I'm concerned. I was teaching a seminar at Stanford last trimester under the title, What's Left of Marx? And it was a serious title. I didn't want to say everything is left, as if I was a Marxist, which I'm not, or nothing is left. I wanted to see what's left of Marx. And it was interesting to see that my students were fascinated by this idea of a future class-free society. Only, the older among you know that, there is not much in Marx in which he describes what could a class-free society be. And that got us into the seminar not so much to imagine what Marx would have imagined a class-free society to be, but whether we could imagine an alternative society, and I'm not even saying society, an alternative way of living together that we would find more desirable than the present one. Not that we necessarily think the present one is horrible, but are we capable of imagining a way of living together that we found more appealing than the way we were living together now? I think these are tasks of the humanities, not in the sense that you then write a party program, but that we constitute a horizon of imagination that keeps society flexible and open for change. I don't know whether this was an answer to your question, but it mattered to me to say that.
What do you think if we finish at this point in discussion, we continue on Thursday, or should we go on?
No, I mean, I know that many people are hungry, and if I stop talking for 10 seconds, I'm hungry too. So I thank you very much.